Close your eyes and imagine this, the sound of rain. Not a gentle patter, not even a thunderstorm that rolls through and passes on. This is different. This is rain that falls constantly, relentlessly, day after day, month after month, year after year. The sound never stops. It becomes the background noise of existence itself. Every morning you wake up, it's raining. Every night you fall asleep, it's raining. Your children are born into rain. They grow up, have children of their own, and those children never see a day without rain either. Now stretch that out. Not for a week, not for a year, not even for a century. This rain falls for 2 million years straight. 2 million years. Try to wrap your mind around that number. All of recorded human history, every civilization that ever rose and fell, every pharaoh, every emperor, every war, every achievement, all of that spans maybe 5,000 years. This rain lasted 400 times longer than all of human civilization combined. If you had been standing there when it started, your descendants 80,000 generations later would still be waiting for it to stop. This sounds like mythology, right? Like something out of an ancient flood legend or a fantasy novel. But here's the thing that makes your skin crawl. This actually happened. This is documented geological fact. Scientists can read it in the rocks, layer after layer of sediment that screams one word over and over: rain, 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 rain. Around 234 million years ago, something went catastrophically wrong with Earth's climate. The sky quite literally broke open, and it didn't close again for an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. What we're talking about is the Carnian pluvial episode, and it's one of the most bizarre and dramatic climate events in our planet's entire 4.5 billion year history. Yet until recently, hardly anyone knew it happened. The consequences were staggering. We're talking about a mass extinction event that wiped out entire groups of species that had dominated the planet for millions of years. We're talking about the complete transformation of ecosystems across the globe. Deserts turned into swamps, coastlines were redrawn, ocean chemistry went haywire, life on Earth was pushed to the absolute brink. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Out of this catastrophe, out of 2 million years of endless rain and dying species and collapsing ecosystems, something new emerged. Something that would change the course of life on Earth forever. The dinosaurs. Those 80-ton giants that would rule the planet for the next 165 million years. They didn't just survive the endless deluge. They thrived because of it. The rain that killed off their competitors created the perfect conditions for their rise to dominance. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe hit subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. There. I read the comments and it's always wild. Sydney at sunrise, Chicago at 2 a.m, London during lunch break, all listening to the same ancient story at the same time. What could possibly cause rain to fall for 2 million years? That's not a normal weather pattern. That's not even a normal climate shift. That's something so extreme, so far outside the boundaries of anything humans have ever experienced, that when scientists first discovered evidence for it, many of them simply didn't believe it. They thought the data had to be wrong. Because rain for 2 million years straight, that's impossible, except it's not. It happened. The evidence is buried in rock scattered across what's now Europe, North America, South America, and Asia. Everywhere geologists look from this time period, they find the same thing. Massive deposits of sediment laid down by water, not occasional floods, continuous, relentless water. The chemical signatures in these rocks tell a story of a world drowning under perpetual storms. But this isn't just about rain. This is about understanding how dramatically our planet can change, how quickly stability can turn into chaos, how life, pushed to the edge of extinction, can adapt and evolve in ways that reshape everything. The Carnian pluvial episode is a reminder that Earth has been through climate catastrophes that make anything in human experience look trivial by comparison. and yet life survived. Not just survived, but exploded into new forms, new strategies, new dominance hierarchies. The world that emerged when the rain finally stopped was completely different from the world that existed before, and in many ways we're still living in that post-rain reality. The dinosaurs rose, eventually they fell, but their descendants, the birds, are still here. And so are we, mammals who only got our chance because the dinosaurs eventually made room. So let's go back, way back, before the rain started, before the sky broke open. To understand what happened during those 2 million years of endless storms, we first need to understand what the world looked like before everything changed. We need to set the stage for the greatest weather event in Earth's history. Before we get to the rain, before the sky opened up and stayed open for 2 million years, we need to understand what Earth looked like. Because the world that existed before the deluge was so alien, so fundamentally different from anything we know today, that it might as well have been another planet. Picture this. 250 million years ago, there are no separate continents, no Atlantic Ocean, no Pacific as we know it, no Mediterranean Sea, no Indian Ocean, no separate land masses dotting a watery globe. Instead, every piece of land on Earth is jammed together into one massive supercontinent. Geologists call it Pangaea, which literally means all Earth. And that name isn't poetic exaggeration, it's geographical fact. Stand anywhere on Pangaea and you could theoretically walk to anywhere else on land without ever seeing an ocean. From what would become Antarctica to what would become Alaska, from future Australia to future Norway, it was all connected. One unbroken landmass stretching from pole to pole, from the eastern edge of the world to the western edge. And it was enormous. We're talking about a continent that covered roughly a third of Earth's surface, thousands upon thousands of miles in every direction. But here's what made Pangaea truly extreme. It wasn't just big, it was positioned in a way that created the most hostile climate system Earth has ever known. The interior of this supercontinent, the vast heartland hundreds or thousands of miles from any coast, was essentially one gigantic desert. And when I say desert, I don't mean the Sahara, I don't mean Death Valley, I mean something worse. Imagine the driest place on Earth today, then imagine it stretched across an area the size of Asia. That's what you're dealing with. Why was it so dry? Basic atmospheric physics. When air masses move over oceans, they pick up moisture through evaporation. When those moist air masses hit land, they start dropping that moisture as rain. But the farther inland you go, the less moisture remains in the air. Modern continents have this problem to some degree. That's why Central Asia is drier than coastal China, why Nevada is drier than California. But Pangaea took this principle to an extreme that makes modern geography look tame. Air masses moving inland from the coast would drop their moisture in the first few hundred miles. By the time they reached the interior, they were bone dry. And unlike modern continents, there was nowhere else for moisture to come from. No inland seas, no mountain ranges forcing air upward to create localized rain systems. Just flat, endless desert stretching to the horizon and beyond. The temperature swings in this interior wasteland would have been absolutely brutal. Without large bodies of water to moderate climate, summers in the Pangaean interior could reach temperatures that would kill most modern animals within hours. We're talking 120, 130, maybe even 140 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. If you could find any shade. Winters, meanwhile, could plunge well below freezing, even in equatorial regions. The thin, dry air couldn't hold heat once the sun went down. Nighttime temperatures might drop 60 or 70 degrees from daytime highs. This created a landscape that was almost entirely barren. Vast stretches of red rock and sand baked hard by relentless sun, scoured by dust storms that could last for weeks. If you were transported to the Pangaean interior, you'd probably think you'd landed on Mars. The resemblance wouldn't be accidental, but life, as it always does, found a way. Not in the interior, not in those vast dead zones, but along the coasts and in a few scattered regions where geography created slightly less hostile conditions. Life was hanging on. and it was weird. This was the late Permian period, just a few million years after the worst mass extinction in Earth's history. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, sometimes called the Great Dying, had wiped out roughly 95% of all species on the planet. The ecosystems that were rebuilding in the aftermath were unlike anything that had come before or would come after. The dominant land animals weren't dinosaurs. Dinosaurs didn't exist yet. They weren't even mammals. Mammals were still just a gleam in evolution's eye, represented only by tiny shrew-like creatures that spent most of their time hiding from predators. No, the rulers of late Permian Earth were synapsids. Think of them as mammal-like reptiles, though that description doesn't really do them justice. They were their own thing, a unique branch of the vertebrate family tree that had been evolving separately from true reptiles for tens of millions of years. Some synapsids were massive, creatures like moschops, bulky herbivores the size of modern hippos, with thick skulls and stocky bodies built to survive in harsh conditions. They probably spent their days grazing on the tough primitive plants that grew near water sources, always staying close to whatever moisture they could find. Others were predators, animals like gorgonops, with saber-like canine teeth and powerful jaws. These were the apex predators of their time, hunting along the coasts and around the rare inland water sources where prey congregated. Some species reached lengths of 10 feet or more. They had features that look remarkably mammal-like in some ways, differentiated teeth, possibly even whiskers, maybe the beginnings of fur or hair. But they weren't mammals, they were something else, an evolutionary experiment that was about to run into a hard deadline. The plant life was equally strange. The forests that existed weren't like modern forests. There were no flowering plants. Those wouldn't evolve for another 100 million years. No grass either. Grass was still far in the future. Instead, the vegetation was dominated by seed ferns, early conifers, and primitive plants that looked like something out of a Dr. Seuss book. These forests hugged the coastlines, never venturing more than a few hundred miles inland. They couldn't. The interior was too dry, too hot, too hostile. So life concentrated in narrow bands around the edges of the supercontinent, leaving the vast interior essentially dead. But even the coastal regions weren't exactly pleasant. Pangaea's climate wasn't just extreme, it was violently unstable. The massive landmass created atmospheric circulation patterns that had no modern equivalent. The coastal regions experienced monsoons that would make modern tropical cyclones look like spring showers. Here's how it worked. During summer in the northern hemisphere, the enormous landmass of Pangaea would heat up dramatically. Hot air rises, creating a massive low-pressure system over the continent. Meanwhile, the Panthalassic Ocean, that world-spanning body of water that surrounded Pangaea, stayed relatively cool. Ocean temperatures don't fluctuate as wildly as land temperatures, so you had this tremendous temperature and pressure differential between land and sea. The result was monsoons on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Massive air masses laden with moisture would sweep inland from the ocean, driven by the pressure differential. They'd hit the coast and dump months' worth of rain in a matter of weeks. Flash floods would tear through river valleys. Mudslides would bury entire ecosystems. The rain would be so heavy you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you. So violent that it would strip leaves off trees and erode hillsides. Then it would stop. And for the rest of the year, barely a drop would fall. The land would dry out, rivers would dwindle to trickles or disappear entirely. The plants and animals that had survived the violent wet season would then have to survive months of drought. This pattern repeated every year, year after year, creating ecosystems adapted to extremes. Plants that could survive being flooded for weeks and then bone dry for months. Animals that could gorge themselves during the wet season and then essentially hibernate through the dry season. Everything was pushed to its limits, all the time, and this was considered normal. This was just how Earth worked when all the land was jammed together into one supercontinent. The Panthalassic Ocean itself was another piece of this extreme puzzle. It was the largest single body of water in Earth's history, covering roughly 2/3 of the planet's surface. One unbroken ocean stretching from pole to pole, interrupted only by Pangaea. The word panthalassic means all seas, and that's exactly what it was. But don't imagine it as some peaceful blue expanse. The panthalassic was wild. Without continents to break up wave patterns, storms could build to enormous sizes. Hurricanes larger than anything we see today would spin across thousands of miles of open water. Ocean currents, uninterrupted by land masses, would circle the globe, creating temperature differentials and upwelling zones that modern oceanography can barely model. The interaction between this massive ocean and the massive continent created Earth's climate engine. Warm water from the equator would flow toward the poles. Cold water from the poles would sink and flow along the ocean floor toward the equator. These currents carried heat and moisture around the planet, but in patterns completely unlike modern ocean circulation. The result was a world of extremes: extreme heat, extreme cold, extreme dryness, extreme flooding. No middle ground, no temperate zones where life could exist comfortably. Everything was marginal, everything was stressed, everything was barely hanging on. This was the world that existed 250 million years ago, a world that was stable in its way. The climate patterns were extreme but predictable. The ecosystems were harsh but functional. Life had adapted to the extremes, found ways to survive in the narrow zones where survival was possible. The synapsids ruled the land. The primitive plants held the coasts. The panthalassic ocean surrounded it all like a vast moat. It wasn't Eden. It wasn't even particularly hospitable. But it worked. The planet had found a kind of equilibrium, harsh as it was. Species were diversifying again after the Great Dying. Ecosystems were becoming more complex. Evolution was doing its patient work, generation by generation, slowly filling niches and adapting to challenges. For millions of years this system held. The monsoons came and went. The synapsids hunted and grazed. The forest grew and died back with the seasons. It was extreme, but it was stable. And then, 234 million years ago, something changed. The first signs were subtle. Slightly heavier rains during monsoon season in some regions. Slightly longer wet periods in others. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make you think the world was about to be transformed. But those were just the first drops, the opening notes of a symphony of chaos that would play for the next 2 million years. Because what was about to happen wasn't just another monsoon season. It wasn't just another climate fluctuation in a world already defined by extreme climate. What was about to happen was the most prolonged precipitation event in Earth's history. An atmospheric catastrophe so severe that it would drown deserts, transform ecosystems, drive countless species extinct, and ultimately reshape the entire future of life on this planet. The sky was about to break open, and it wouldn't close again for 2 million years. Before we get to 2 million years of rain, we need to talk about what made that rain possible. We need to go back even further to an event so catastrophic that it makes every other disaster in Earth's history look like a minor inconvenience. We need to talk about the day the world almost ended. 252 million years ago, Earth was not having a good time. The Permian period had been relatively stable for millions of years. Complex ecosystems had developed on land and in the oceans. Forests covered vast regions of the supercontinent Pangaea. The seas teemed with life. Trilobites, those armoured arthropods that had dominated marine environments for over 250 million years. Ancient sharks and fish. Coral reefs that stretched for hundreds of miles. On land, proto-mammals called synapsids were the dominant large animals. Some were predators the size of bears. Others were herbivores that moved in great herds across ancient plains. It wasn't paradise exactly. Life was strange and alien by our standards. But it was working. Ecosystems were balanced, Evolutionary pressures were creating new species, and the planet seemed to be humming along just fine. Then Siberia started exploding. Not metaphorically, literally exploding. Magma from deep in Earth's mantle found weaknesses in the crust beneath what is now northern Russia and began erupting on a scale that defies comprehension. This wasn't a volcano. This wasn't even a chain of volcanoes. This was something geologists call a flood basalt eruption, and it would continue for roughly 2 million years. Picture this. Lava flows covering an area the size of the continental United States. Not all at once, but wave after wave, eruption after eruption, each one adding another layer of molten rock to the growing wasteland. The total volume of lava eventually reached about 4 million cubic kilometers. That's enough to bury the entire surface of Earth under 10 meters of basalt. Except it didn't spread evenly. It piled up in Siberia, creating what geologists now call the Siberian Traps, a landscape of stacked lava flows up to 3 kilometers thick in some places. But the lava itself wasn't the real problem. Lava flows, even massive ones, are localized disasters. They destroy whatever they cover, but life elsewhere can survive. The real problem was what came with the lava. Every eruption released colossal amounts of volcanic gases into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, methane, and a toxic cocktail of other compounds. We're not talking about the relatively modest emissions from modern volcanoes. A single major eruption in the Siberian Traps likely released more greenhouse gases than all of human civilization has produced to date. And these eruptions continued for 2 million years. The carbon dioxide began warming the planet almost immediately. Global temperatures started climbing, 5 degrees Celsius above baseline, then 10. Eventually the planet was 15 to 20 degrees Celsius warmer than it had been before the eruption started. This doesn't sound like much until you realize what it means for global ecosystems. The equatorial regions became uninhabitable. Temperatures regularly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius during the day. Nothing could survive there. No plants, no animals, nothing. The tropical zones that had been the most biodiverse regions on the planet became dead zones where nothing moved except dust storms. But the warming was just the beginning. The sulfur dioxide combined with water vapor in the atmosphere to create sulfuric acid. Acid rain began falling across the planet. Not occasionally, constantly, for thousands of years at a time. The pH of rainfall dropped so low that it could dissolve limestone and corrode exposed rock. Forests died as the acidic water destroyed their leaves and poisoned their roots. Soils became toxic wastelands where nothing could grow. The oceans absorbed some of the carbon dioxide, which sounds like it might have helped, except it triggered a different catastrophe. Ocean acidification. As CO2 dissolved in seawater, it formed carbonic acid, gradually lowering the pH of the oceans. This made it increasingly difficult for marine organisms to build shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate. Coral reefs began dissolving. Shellfish couldn't form their protective coverings. The base of the marine food web started collapsing. Then came the anoxia. As the oceans warmed, they lost their ability to hold dissolved oxygen. Cold water can hold much more oxygen than warm water, and as global temperatures climbed, the ocean's oxygen content plummeted. The first regions to go anoxic were the deep ocean basins. Life there died first, silently in the dark, as the water that had sustained them for hundreds of millions of years became toxic. But the anoxic zones didn't stay in the depths. They expanded upward and outward, creeping into shallower waters, eventually reaching the productive coastal zones where most marine life lived. Fish suffocated. Invertebrates died in massive numbers. The oceans began to stink of hydrogen sulfide, a byproduct of anaerobic bacteria that thrive in oxygen-free environments. This same gas that smells like rotten eggs is also highly toxic. As it bubbled up from the dying oceans, it poisoned coastal ecosystems and added yet another stress to terrestrial life that was already being hammered by heat, acid rain, and collapsing food webs. The extinction began gradually, individual species disappearing here and there, isolated populations dying off, ecosystems becoming slightly less diverse year by year. But then it accelerated. The combined stresses of warming, acidification, anoxia, and atmospheric toxins reached a tipping point. What had been a slow decline became a cascading collapse. Marine ecosystems went first. The Permian oceans had been incredibly diverse, filled with thousands of species that had evolved over tens of millions of years. Within about 60,000 years, which is geologically instantaneous, 96% of them were gone. Not declined, not reduced in numbers, gone, extinct, forever. Trilobites, which had survived multiple previous mass extinctions, went completely extinct. Not a single species survived. Ancient fish lineages that had dominated the seas for 100 million years vanished. The coral reefs that had taken millions of years to build dissolved into the acidic waters, leaving behind nothing but sediment. On land, the devastation was only slightly less complete. About 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species went extinct. The great forests died, killed by heat, acid rain, and atmospheric toxins. The dominant synapsids, those proto-mammals that had ruled the land, were nearly wiped out. A few lineages survived, huddling in whatever refuges they could find, but their age of dominance was over. Even insects suffered catastrophically. This is remarkable because insects are usually incredibly resilient to extinctions. They're small, they reproduce quickly, they can adapt to changing conditions faster than most other organisms, but the Permian Triassic extinction was so severe that it's the only mass extinction in Earth's history where insect diversity declined significantly. It takes something truly apocalyptic to push insects to the brink. The ecological collapse was total. Food webs disintegrated as key species disappeared. Predators starved when their prey went extinct. Herbivores died when the plants they depended on vanished. Decomposers were overwhelmed by the sheer amount of dead organic matter, leading to accumulations of unrotted vegetation and animal remains. Fungal blooms appeared across the dying landscape, feeding on the corpses of forests and animals alike. Some geological layers from this period are dominated by fungal spores, evidence of a world where decay organisms briefly became more abundant than living plants. Picture walking through this world, if you somehow could. You'd see landscapes of dead trees, their trunks stripped of bark, their branches naked and brittle, slowly being buried by ash and dust. The soil beneath your feet would be grey and lifeless, too toxic to support plant growth. The rivers would run thick with sediment, no longer held in place by plant roots, eroding landscapes that had been stable for millions of years. The sky would be a perpetual haze of volcanic aerosols, blocking much of the sun's light, creating a twilight world even at noon. The oceans would be worse. Approaching the coast, the smell would hit you first. Hydrogen sulfide, rot, decay on a planetary scale. The water would be murky, choked with algae and bacteria, mostly anaerobic species that thrive in oxygen-free conditions. No fish would break the surface. No seabirds would dive for prey. The beaches would be covered with the shells of dead organisms, slowly dissolving in the acidic water, creating a white froth of calcium carbonate that marked the high tide line. In some regions, massive blooms of green sulfur bacteria would turn the water purple or green, creating an alien seascape unlike anything in the modern world. These bacteria photosynthesize using hydrogen sulfide instead of water, and they only thrive in anoxic conditions. Their presence is a marker of dead oceans, of water so devoid of oxygen that normal photosynthetic organisms can't survive. This was Earth at its absolute worst. This was the closest life has ever come to complete extinction since complex organisms first evolved. Some estimates suggest the total biomass of Earth, the combined weight of all living things, declined by 90% or more. The planet was dying. But here's what's important for our story. Life didn't end. It came terrifyingly close, but it didn't end. in a few scattered refuges, in coastal areas where ocean currents still brought oxygen, in high-latitude regions where temperatures remained tolerable, in isolated valleys where local conditions created temporary safe zones, life hung on. A few species of early reptiles survived. Some amphibians made it through. A handful of synapsid lineages clung to existence. In the oceans, a few species of fish, some bivalves, a scattering of marine reptiles. These survivors weren't living well. They were barely existing, holding on by their claws and teeth, watching 96% of their fellow species vanish into extinction. But they were alive, and that's all evolution needs. A few survivors, a bit of genetic diversity, and time. The extinction lasted somewhere between 60,000 and 200,000 years. The most intense phase, when the majority of species disappeared, probably happened in less than 20,000 years. Then, gradually, the Siberian traps began to quiet down. The eruptions became less frequent. The atmospheric injection of greenhouse gases slowed. The planet began to stabilize at its new hellish baseline. 15 degrees warmer than before, with anoxic oceans, degraded soils, and simplified ecosystems, but stable. This was the world that existed when our story really begins. This was the early Triassic, roughly 252 million years ago. A hot, harsh, damaged world, populated by survivors of the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life. Everything that came after, including 2 million years of rain, was in some sense a consequence of the Great Dying. Because the Permian-Triassic extinction didn't just kill species, it reset the entire planetary system. It changed ocean chemistry, atmospheric composition, global climate patterns. It created empty ecological niches that would eventually be filled by entirely new kinds of organisms, and it set up the conditions that would lead to the Carnian pluvial episode, the event that would bring rain for 2 million years and change the trajectory of life on Earth forever. The survivors didn't know it, but they were standing at the beginning of the age of reptiles, the age that would eventually produce the dinosaurs. But first, they had to make it through the recovery period, and that recovery would take millions of years. First, they had to survive what came next. But before those first humans would face their genetic bottleneck, before mammals would even become a significant presence on Earth, something else happened. Something that makes our species' brush with extinction look almost quaint by comparison. 234 million years ago, the sky broke open and didn't close again for 2 million years. Scientists call it the Carnian pluvial episode. The name sounds clinical, almost boring, like something you'd skip over in a geology textbook. But don't let that fool you. This was one of the most catastrophic, bizarre, and ultimately transformative events in Earth's entire history. A climate disaster so extreme, it makes modern climate change look like a minor weather fluctuation. A period of rainfall so prolonged that it fundamentally restructured life on our planet. And here's the wildest part. We almost didn't discover it at all. The story begins in the 1970s in the Dolomite Mountains of northern Italy, part of the Alps. Geologists were studying rock formations from the Triassic period, trying to piece together what Earth looked like during the age of early dinosaurs. They noticed something odd, something that didn't make sense according to the prevailing theories about Triassic climate. For millions of years, the rock layers showed exactly what they expected. Red sandstones, oxidized sediments, the geological signature of hot, dry conditions. Desert world preserved in stone, the kind of environment where reptiles thrived and moisture was precious. Layer after layer of these red rocks told the same story. Earth during the Triassic was dry, hot, and stable. Then suddenly the rocks changed colour. Grey sediments appeared. Not just a thin layer, not just a brief interruption, but hundreds of meters of grey stone deposited over what must have been an enormous span of time. These weren't desert rocks. These were water rocks, sediments laid down by rivers, lakes, and massive flooding events. The kind of deposits you only get when water is abundant, persistent, and powerful. At first, geologists thought this was just a local phenomenon. Maybe an ancient river system had shifted course. Maybe some regional climate pattern had brought temporary moisture to this particular corner of the Triassic world. Local anomalies happen all the time in geology, no big deal. Except then they found the same pattern in other parts of Italy, and Austria, and Germany, and Britain, and Poland. And then, as geological surveys expanded globally, they started finding it everywhere. Argentina, China, North America, Australia, Africa. Everywhere they looked, the same pattern emerged. Dry red rocks, then a sudden shift to grey water-deposited sediments spanning millions of years, then eventually a return to drier conditions. All at the same time in Earth's geological history. All during a very specific window in the late Triassic, during a time period geologists call the Carnian stage. This wasn't a local phenomenon. This was global. Something had happened to Earth's entire climate system. Something that had turned the planet into a water world for an almost incomprehensible length of time. The geological evidence was overwhelming once researchers knew what to look for. Those grey sedimentary layers contained distinctive features that told detailed stories about ancient water conditions. Ripple marks from flowing water, mud cracks where temporary pools had dried up briefly before filling again. Plant fossils showing species adapted to wet environments, replacing desert-adapted species. Coal deposits, which only form in persistently wet conditions with abundant plant growth. Most tellingly, the rocks showed something called cyclical sedimentation, repeating patterns of different sediment types stacked on top of each other, evidence of regular, predictable flooding cycles. Not random chaos, but systematic, long-term. Changes in water levels, rivers flooding and receding, lakes expanding and contracting. This was a climate system in a completely different configuration than what came before or after. But the really convincing evidence came from geochemistry. When scientists analysed the chemical composition of these ancient rocks, they found unmistakable signatures of dramatic climate change. Carbon isotope ratios shifted dramatically at the beginning of the wet period, indicating massive injections of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Oxygen isotopes in ancient soils revealed changes in temperature and rainfall patterns. Sulfur isotopes pointed to increased weathering of rocks, which only happens when you have lots of water flowing over the landscape for extended periods. The chemistry didn't lie. Something had fundamentally altered Earth's atmosphere and climate system, triggering a shift from a relatively stable, dry world to a wet, unstable world that persisted for millions of years. But what could cause something like this? What force could be powerful enough to completely transform Earth's climate for such an extended period? The answer, once again, was volcanoes. But not just any volcanoes, not a single eruption or even a century of eruptions. We're talking about one of the most sustained volcanic events in Earth's history, a geological catastrophe that made the Permian extinction's Siberian traps look almost modest. The culprit was the Wrangellia province, a massive volcanic region that was actively erupting during the late Triassic. Now, here's where geography gets interesting. During the Carnian, Wrangellia wasn't located where it is today. Plate tectonics had scattered its remnants across what is now Alaska, British Columbia, and parts of the Pacific Northwest. But 234 million years ago, it was positioned differently, and it was absolutely hemorrhaging lava. We're not talking about Mount St. Helens-style eruptions. We're talking about flood basalt eruptions, where lava doesn't explode out of a cone-shaped volcano, but instead pours out of massive cracks in Earth's crust like blood from a wound. These eruptions can continue for hundreds or thousands of years, covering enormous areas with layer after layer of basalt rock. The Wrangellia eruptions produce somewhere between 1 and 3 million cubic kilometres of lava. To put that in perspective, that's enough molten rock to bury the entire continental United States under a layer 100 metres deep. And it didn't erupt all at once. It poured out over hundreds of thousands of years, a geological sustained bombardment of our planet's atmosphere. With the lava came gases, unimaginable quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other volcanic volatiles vented directly into the atmosphere. Each year of eruptions added millions of tons of greenhouse gases to an atmosphere that was already warmer than our modern world. Carbon dioxide levels that had been elevated began to skyrocket even higher. Here's how the cascade began. The volcanic CO2 started warming the planet through the greenhouse effect. Basic physics. Same mechanism threatening us today, but on a far more extreme scale. As temperatures rose, the atmosphere could hold more moisture. More moisture meant more clouds. More clouds meant more rain. But it wasn't a simple linear progression. This was a climate system approaching a tipping point. The warming also affected ocean circulation patterns. The Triassic supercontinent Pangaea was beginning to break apart, creating new ocean basins. As these oceans warmed, they released even more moisture into the atmosphere through evaporation. The tropical regions, already hot, became engines of atmospheric convection, pulling moisture up from the oceans and dumping it back down as rain. Then came the feedback loops. As rain increased, more carbon dioxide was pulled out of the atmosphere through chemical weathering of rocks. But the volcanic eruptions kept pumping more CO2 back in, overwhelming the system's natural regulatory mechanisms. The climate couldn't stabilize. It was locked into a pattern of extreme greenhouse warming punctuated by massive rainfall events. Chemical signatures in the rocks show multiple pulses of carbon dioxide injection, suggesting the Wrangellia eruptions weren't continuous, but occurred in episodes separated by periods of reduced activity. Each pulse would have driven the climate into a more extreme state. Each pulse would have intensified the rainfall. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these repeated volcanic episodes kept pushing Earth's climate system further from equilibrium. By about 234 million years ago, the transformation was complete. The relatively stable, arid world of the early to mid-Triassic was gone, replaced by something almost unrecognizable. A hot, humid, stormy planet where rain fell with a frequency and intensity that modern Earth has never experienced. Where deserts transformed into wetlands, where new river systems carved through ancient rocks, where the rules of survival that had governed terrestrial life for tens of millions of years suddenly no longer applied. The fossil record marks this transition with unmistakable clarity. Species that had dominated the late Triassic began disappearing from the geological record right at the boundary, where the rocks change from red to grey. Desert-adapted plants vanished. Reptiles that had thrived in arid conditions became scarce or went extinct entirely. In their place, new species began appearing, species adapted to wet conditions, species that could thrive in a world where water was no longer the limiting resource. This wasn't an instantaneous change. Climate shifts, even catastrophic ones, take time to manifest fully across an entire planet. The initial stages probably seemed subtle. Slightly more rain than usual, rivers flowing where dry washes had existed for millennia. Plants spreading into previously barren areas, animals following the spreading vegetation. But then it accelerated. Within perhaps a few thousand years, which is nothing in geological terms, the full force of the climate transformation hit. And once it began, it showed no signs of stopping. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the rain continued. Not constantly, not everywhere at once, but with such frequency and intensity that Earth's landscape was permanently transformed. The volcanic eruptions continued their episodic pattern. Each new pulse brought another spike in atmospheric CO2, another surge of warming, another intensification of the hydrological cycle. The planet was locked into a feedback loop it couldn't escape, driven by geological forces operating on timescales that made even millions of years seem brief. This was the beginning of the Carnian pluvial episode. 2 million years of rainfall that would kill most of the species alive at the time, transform Earth's landscapes beyond recognition, and create the ecological conditions that would allow a group of relatively insignificant reptiles to rise to planetary dominance. The dinosaurs were about to inherit the Earth, but first everything else had to die. Let's get one thing straight right away. When we say it rained for 2 million years, we don't mean there was a single continuous storm that lasted for 2 million years, with rain falling every single second of every single day. That's not how climate works. That's not how anything works. What actually happened was somehow even more dramatic. Picture instead a world where the baseline precipitation increased by 400 to 500% compared to what came before, where continental interiors that had been bone-dry deserts for millions of years suddenly became humid, vegetation-choked swamps, where seasonal monsoons intensified to levels that would make modern tropical storms look like light drizzle, where the fundamental relationship between land and water was completely rewritten. This wasn't a storm. This was a planetary transformation. Before the Carnian pluvial episode began, most of Pangaea's interior was basically Mars, dry, dusty, hostile to complex life. Rain fell mainly along the coasts, and even there it was seasonal and unpredictable. The supercontinent was so massive that moisture from the oceans couldn't penetrate more than a few hundred miles inland. Everything beyond that threshold was desert. Not the romantic sand dune deserts you see in movies, but flat, gravelly wastelands baked under a sun that seemed to get hotter every year. Then the volcanism started pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at unprecedented rates. Global temperatures spiked, and the hydrological cycle went absolutely berserk. The first thing that happened was the oceans got warmer, not just at the surface, but deep down throughout the entire water column. Warmer water means more evaporation. Way more. The tropical oceans around Pangaea's equatorial belt became massive heat engines, pumping water vapour into the atmosphere at rates the planet hadn't seen since the early days of complex life. That moisture had to go somewhere. Initially it fell back into the ocean, but as the atmospheric water content increased, something incredible happened. The monsoon systems that had always brought seasonal rain to Pangaea's coasts intensified beyond anything the planet had experienced in 100 million years. These weren't normal monsoons, these were mega monsoons, continental-scale circulation patterns that could dump what we would consider a year's worth of rain in a single month. Imagine standing on what would one day become Central Europe during the height of the wet season. The sky would be dark almost constantly, not pitch black like night, but a heavy, oppressive grey that pressed down on everything. The air would be so thick with humidity you could practically drink it. Every breath would feel like inhaling warm soup. Then the rains would come, not gentle spring showers, not even violent thunderstorms like we experience today. These were curtains of water falling from the sky so dense you couldn't see more than a few feet through them. The sound would be deafening, a constant roar like standing next to a waterfall. The ground would disappear beneath the inches, then feet of flowing water within minutes, and it wouldn't stop, not for days, sometimes not for weeks. When the rain finally paused, you wouldn't find the dry ground you started with. You'd find mud, thick, churned up, ankle-deep mud stretching in every direction, standing water in every depression, and rivers. So many rivers, where no rivers had existed before. The transformation of continental interiors was the most dramatic change. Areas that had been dead zones, places where almost nothing could survive, suddenly became lush and alive. The first rains would have been chaotic, all that water hitting dry, compacted soil that had no vegetation to hold it in place. Flash floods of biblical proportions would have scoured the landscape, carving new channels, moving megatons of sediment, completely reshaping the topography. But then something magical happened. Seeds that had been dormant for centuries, maybe millennia, waiting for conditions that their ancestors had known millions of years earlier, they woke up. spores of ferns and primitive plants that had been transported on the wind from coastal areas found themselves in environments that could actually support them, and they exploded across the landscape. Within a few thousand years, which is nothing in geological terms, Pangaea's interior was transformed from desert to rainforest. Not tropical rainforest like the Amazon, at least not at first, but something stranger. Imagine forests dominated by tree ferns and early conifers, their roots constantly soaked, growing in pure mud rather than proper soil. Cycads sprouting from standing water. Horsetails the size of telephone poles forming impenetrable thickets along every waterway. The rivers themselves were unlike anything in the modern world. They would swell to tremendous size during the wet season, spreading across floodplains that could be dozens of miles wide. The water would be dark with suspended sediment, thick as chocolate milk, carrying everything from microscopic particles to entire trees torn from newly established forests upstream. Then, during the dry season, they wouldn't disappear completely like rivers in modern deserts. They'd shrink, but they'd remain. Permanent water sources connecting the coast to the interior for the first time in Pangaea's history. This created highways for life to colonize inward, pathways for fish, amphibians and early reptiles to reach territories their ancestors could never have accessed. Lakes formed everywhere. Not planned, not slowly over millions of years, but spontaneously. Any depression in the landscape became a lake. Some were small, pond-sized, lasting only a single wet season. Others were massive, inland seas that would persist for hundreds of thousands of years. Geological evidence from this period shows lake deposits in central Pangaea that covered areas larger than any modern lake. These weren't just puddles. These were legitimate freshwater seas, complete with their own ecosystems, their own food chains. The coastlines changed too. Sea levels rose from all that thermal expansion of the warming oceans. Coastal lowlands that had been dry land for millions of years flooded, creating vast new shallow marine environments. These areas became nurseries for marine life, protected lagoons and estuaries where species could evolve and diversify away from the open ocean predators. But the most alien thing about this world wasn't what you could see. It was what you could smell and hear. The smell would have been overwhelming. Not bad necessarily, but intense. That deep, earthy petrichor smell that comes when rain hits dry ground, except amplified 1,000 times and lasting for months. Mixed with that would be the smell of rotting vegetation, because all those newly established plants were also dying in massive numbers, their remains piling up in the floodwaters. Add the distinctive metallic smell of wet rock, the organic scent of mud, and occasional whiffs of volcanic sulphur still drifting on the wind from the Rangelia eruptions. The sounds would be just as distinctive. The constant background roar of rain during the wet season, the rushing of rivers so loud you'd have to shout to be heard over them, the drip and splash of water falling from leaves in the brief pauses between storms, and life, lots and lots of life. The chirping of early insects that were evolving to take advantage of all this water, the calls of amphibians gathering in every pond and puddle to breed, the splashing of fish in rivers that had never had fish before. At night, the darkness would be absolute during the wet season when cloud cover was complete. No stars, no moon, just the sound of rain, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminating a landscape that looked more like an alien planet than Earth. This wasn't happening in just one place. The geological evidence is clear. Every continent that was part of Pangaea shows sedimentary deposits from this period that indicate dramatically increased rainfall. Drill cores from what's now Italy show lake beds stacked one on top of another, each representing wet periods during the Carnian. Rock formations in the southwestern United States contain river channel deposits from this time, cutting through what had been pure desert. Even Antarctica, which was part of Pangaea and positioned much further north than today, shows evidence of increased precipitation during the Carnian. The episode wasn't constant in its intensity. There were pulses. periods of a few 100,000 years where the rain was most intense, followed by relative dry periods that were still much wetter than what came before. Scientists have identified at least 4 major wet pulses during the 2 million year episode, each triggered by renewed volcanic activity pumping more greenhouse gases into an already overheated atmosphere. During the wettest phases, you could have canoed from the coast of Pangaea hundreds of miles into the interior, following interconnected river systems and lakes that formed a continent-spanning network of waterways. This had never been possible before. The interior had always been isolated, cut off from the oceans by thousands of miles of uninhabitable desert. Now it was connected, and life poured inward like water finding its level. The seasonal cycle became the defining rhythm of existence. Wet seasons that could last 8 to 9 months, during which the landscape was completely transformed into a water world. Dry seasons that were brief and never quite dried things out completely, just reduced the water levels enough that mud became visible again, and some of the temporary lakes evaporated. This cycle created unique evolutionary pressures. Organisms had to be able to survive both extremes. They needed to handle prolonged flooding during the wet season, but also cope with at least some drying during the brief dry periods. This selected for incredible adaptability, for species that could shift strategies depending on conditions. But here's what makes the Carnian pluvial episode truly mind-blowing. It wasn't a disaster. Not really. Yes, it killed off huge numbers of species that were adapted to the dry conditions that came before. Yes, it completely disrupted ecosystems that had been stable for tens of millions of years. But it also created opportunities on a scale that rarely happens in Earth's history. All that water meant all that life. Photosynthetic organisms went crazy, producing oxygen and organic matter at unprecedented rates. This fed an explosion of animal diversity. The wet world wasn't hostile to life. It was a paradise for life, at least for species that could adapt to it. And some adapted better than others. The stage was set for the most important evolutionary revolution in land animal history. The old rulers of the dry world, the dominant reptile groups that had thrived in Pangaea's deserts, they struggled in the new wet world. They couldn't compete effectively in environments that were constantly waterlogged, where their prey species had been replaced by new forms adapted to humidity and wetlands. But there was a group of reptiles that had been marginal players before the rains came, relatively small, relatively insignificant, lurking in the background while other groups dominated. They had adaptations that seemed unimportant in a dry world, but became crucial advantages in a wet one. Better posture for moving through dense vegetation, more efficient respiratory systems for dealing with humid air, enhanced parental care that helped offspring survive in unstable environments. They were called dinosaurs, and they were about to inherit the Earth. Here's what you need to understand about extinction. It's rarely fair. It's not about being the strongest or the fastest or even the smartest. Sometimes it's just about being unlucky enough to be perfectly adapted to a world that no longer exists. The species that faced the Carnian pluvial episode weren't evolutionary failures. Many of them were the success stories of their time. They had survived the Permian extinction, the worst mass dying in Earth's history. They had spent millions of years adapting to the hot, dry world of the early Triassic. They were good at what they did. They were specialists, masters of surviving in arid environments with seasonal rainfall and long dry periods. And then it started raining. And it didn't stop. The first victims were the ones you'd expect. Species already living on the edge, in marginal habitats, barely hanging on. When the climate shifted, they went first. No drama, no last stands. They just disappeared from the fossil record, their one layer gone the next. But then the dying spread. Species that had been common, that had dominated their ecosystems for millions of years, started vanishing too. And the culprit wasn't some new predator or disease. It was water, too much of it, in all the wrong places, at all the wrong times. Take the dicroidium forests. For 15 million years, this seed fern had been the dominant plant across much of Gondwana, the southern supercontinent. Picture forests stretching thousands of miles, distinctive forked leaves creating canopies that shaded the forest floor, producing seeds that fed countless animal species. Dicrodium had survived the Permian extinction. It had thrived in the recovery period. It was a winner. Then the rains came and Dicrodium started dying. The fossil record shows it clearly. In rock layers from just before the Carnian pluvial episode, Dicrodium pollen and leaf fossils are everywhere. They dominate the plant assemblages. Then you cross into the CPE layers and they start declining. Not all at once, not uniformly, but steadily, relentlessly. And by the end of the wet period, they're effectively gone from most of their former range. Why? Because Dicrodium was adapted for seasonal drought. Its root systems were designed to tap deep water sources during dry periods. Its leaves had structures to minimize water loss. Its seeds could survive long dry spells waiting for the next rains. Everything about it was optimized for a world where water was precious and droughts were the main challenge. Constant rainfall wasn't a blessing for Dicrodium. It was a death sentence. The waterlogged soils changed everything. Root systems that had evolved to penetrate deep couldn't function in saturated ground. They rotted. Fungal diseases that had been kept in check by dry periods exploded in the constant humidity. Seed germination patterns that depended on seasonal cycles stopped working when the seasons disappeared. Within a few 100,000 years, forests that had stood for millions were collapsing, and something else was moving in to replace them. Conifers. Now, conifers had been around for a while. They weren't new, but they had been marginal, restricted to specific environments, overshadowed by the seed ferns. The Carnian pluvial episode changed everything. Conifers were pre-adapted for high moisture. Their needle-like leaves reduced surface area exposed to fungal attack. Their resinous sap provided chemical defense against the rot that thrived in humid conditions. Their root systems could handle waterlogged soils better than the seed ferns. As Dicrodium died back, conifers spread. The fossil evidence shows this transition happening across multiple continents. In Argentina, in Australia, in Antarctica, which was still ice-free and forested, the pattern repeats. Seed ferns declining, conifers ascending, an entire plant kingdom being restructured by too much rain. And when the foundation of an ecosystem changes, everything built on top of it has to change or die. The herbivores that had spent millions of years evolving to eat Dicrodium leaves found themselves in a world where their food source was vanishing. Some adapted, developing the ability to digest conifer needles, which required different gut bacteria and different digestive strategies. Others went extinct. The fossil record from this period shows numerous herbivore groups disappearing, particularly the specialized seed fern feeders. But the transformation wasn't limited to land. In the oceans, something even more dramatic was happening. The coral reefs were dying, not the coral reefs you know today. Those wouldn't evolve for millions of years. These were older reefs, built by different organisms using different strategies. They had recovered slowly after the Permian extinction, spreading through the shallow tropical seas, creating complex ecosystems that supported thousands of species. The Carnian pluvial episode killed them. The mechanism was chemical. All that rain falling on land was washing enormous quantities of sediment and nutrients into the oceans. Rivers that had been small seasonal streams became raging torrents, carrying mud, sand, and organic matter into coastal waters. The water turned murky. Light penetration dropped, and the organisms building the reefs, which depended on clear water and sunlight, started dying. The fossil record from marine deposits during the CPE shows the collapse clearly. Before the event, you find thick reef structures, complex three-dimensional communities. During the event, the reefs thin out, become patchy, then disappear entirely from many areas. After the event, the seafloor looks completely different. No more reefs, just mud and scattered organisms trying to survive in a transformed environment. This wasn't just about corals dying. When reefs collapse, everything that depends on them collapses too. The fish that sheltered in reef crevices, the invertebrates that fed on reef organisms, the predators that hunted in reef environments, all gone, all replaced. Entire marine ecosystems restructuring in response to too much freshwater input. Some groups went extinct entirely. Others were reduced to tiny remnant populations that would take millions of years to recover, and some, the lucky ones, found new opportunities in the changed world. Back on land, the amphibians were facing their own crisis. Many amphibian groups had done well in the early Triassic. They were adapted for semi-arid conditions, breeding in seasonal pools, surviving dry periods by burrowing or finding shelter. The constant rain should have been paradise for them. Amphibians need water, right? Wrong. These amphibians needed seasonal water. They needed dry periods to control diseases, to limit predators, to provide the environmental cues that triggered breeding. Constant moisture created conditions where fungal infections and parasites thrived. Breeding patterns evolved, for seasonal pools stopped working when the pools never dried up. Predators that had been limited by dry seasons suddenly had unlimited access to amphibian habitats. Multiple amphibian groups show sharp declines in the fossil record during the CPE. Some recovered after the rain stopped, others never did. The temnospondyls, large predatory amphibians that had been apex predators in many freshwater environments, were hit particularly hard. Their fossils become rare during the wet period, and many lineages disappear entirely. The reptiles weren't immune either. You might think reptiles, with their watertight skin and efficient kidneys, would handle constant rain better than amphibians. But many Triassic reptiles were adapted for arid conditions. They had behaviours and physiologies optimised for conserving water, avoiding overheating, surviving on a minimal moisture. Constant humidity created new problems. Thermoregulation became difficult when evaporative cooling wasn't available. Nesting sites that had been dry and safe turned into soggy death traps for eggs. Food sources disappeared as the plant communities changed. Diseases and parasites that had been minor annoyances in dry conditions became major threats in constant humidity. The rhynchosaurs, for example, were among the most successful herbivores of the early Triassic. Pig-sized reptiles with specialized beaks for processing tough plant material, they were everywhere. The fossil record shows them at sites across the globe, often the most common large animals. Then the rains came and they started struggling. Rhynchosaur fossils become less common during the CPE. Their diversity drops. Their geographic range contracts. They were losing ground to other herbivore groups that were better adapted to the new conditions. By the end of the wet period, rhynchosaurs were in decline. They wouldn't go extinct immediately, but they never recovered their former dominance. The world had changed, and they couldn't change fast enough to keep up. This is what makes the fossil record from the Carnian pluvial episode so fascinating and so tragic. It's a snapshot of a world in transition, caught between two stable states. Rock layers from just before the event show diverse, established communities, animals and plants that have been living together for millions of years, complex food webs, ecosystems in balance. Then you hit the CPE layers and everything gets weird. The same formation starts showing mixed communities, species that lived in dry environments buried alongside species from wet environments, extinct groups overlapping with their replacements, high diversity in some sites, mass death assemblages in others. It's chaos frozen in stone. Paleontologists can track this transition site by site, layer by layer. In the Germanic basin of Central Europe, normally arid sediments are interrupted by thick sequences of lake deposits and river channels. The fossils change completely. Dry adapted plants disappear, replaced by moisture-loving ferns and conifers. In Argentina's Istigualasto Formation, you see the same pattern, dichroidium forests giving way to conifer-dominated communities. But here's what makes it truly remarkable. Even as established groups were dying off, new groups were emerging. Evolution doesn't take breaks. While some species were going extinct, others were diversifying, moving into newly available ecological niches, experimenting with new survival strategies. The constant rainfall created environments that hadn't existed before: extensive wetlands, year-round rivers, vast lake systems that persisted for thousands of years. These new habitats needed new specialists, and evolution provided them. Small reptiles adapted to living in and around water, developing features for swimming and hunting aquatic prey. Plants evolved that could handle being waterlogged year-round, creating the first true swamp ecosystems. Insects diversified explosively, taking advantage of the abundant moisture and plant life. The fossil record shows numerous new insect groups appearing during the CPE, particularly ones associated with wetland environments. Even some of the groups in decline were producing innovative species. The cynodonts, advanced mammal-like reptiles that had been moderately successful in the early Triassic, began experimenting with new body sizes and diets during the wet period. Some became tiny insect eaters, exploiting the explosion of bug life. Others grew larger, becoming specialized herbivores or omnivores. These experimental lineages would eventually give rise to true mammals, though that was still far in the future. The key insight is that the Carnian pluvial episode wasn't just about death. It was about transformation. Yes, many species went extinct. Yes, established ecosystems collapsed. But the chaos created opportunities. Every extinct species left behind an empty niche. Every collapsed ecosystem created space for something new. And the group that would ultimately benefit most from this chaos, that would use the opportunities created by 2 million years of rain to launch themselves into dominance, were the dinosaurs. But they weren't ready yet. They were still marginal, still rare, still waiting for their moment. That moment was coming. But first they had to survive the rain. They had to adapt to the new world being created around them. They had to outlast the species that were bigger, more established, more successful in the old world. They had to prove they were more than just another group of Triassic reptiles. They had to prove they could inherit the Earth. Now here's where things get really interesting, because while the rest of life was drowning, struggling, going extinct in waves, there was one group of animals that was about to have the best 230 million years of their existence, and they started out as nobody special. Before the rain came, dinosaurs were losers. That's not an exaggeration. Picture the Triassic world around 237 million years ago, just before the deluge started. The dominant land animals were definitely not dinosaurs. They were animals called archosaurs, the ruling reptiles, but not the dinosaur branch. We're talking about massive predators called Rauisuchians, some as big as modern elephants, with skulls 3 feet long filled with teeth like steak knives. We're talking about heavily armoured herbivores called etosaurs, built like scaly tanks, some reaching 15 feet in length. And competing alongside them were the cynodonts, advanced mammal-like reptiles that were smart, adaptable, and successful. And then there were dinosaurs, small ones, marginal ones. Dinosaurs that most paleontologists estimate made up maybe 5% of the animal life in any given ecosystem, maybe less. The earliest dinosaurs we know about were creatures like Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus, living in what's now Argentina around 231 million years ago. They were small, maybe 3 to 6 feet long, bipedal runners that probably ate whatever they could catch or scavenge. They weren't apex predators. They weren't dominant herbivores. They were opportunists living in the shadows of much larger, much more successful animals. Their leg structure was interesting, but not obviously revolutionary. They had an upright stance, legs positioned directly under their bodies rather than sprawling out to the sides like most other reptiles. This made them relatively efficient runners, but plenty of other animals were fast too. They had grasping hands with flexible fingers, useful for catching small prey, but again not unique. They were probably warm-blooded or at least had elevated metabolisms compared to typical reptiles, but we're not sure, and even if they were, other animals might have been too. In short, early dinosaurs were just another group trying to make it in a world dominated by others. And then the sky broke open. When the Carnian pluvial episode began, those dominant animals, those massive Rausuchians and heavily armoured Etosaurs, suddenly found themselves in a world they weren't built for. Remember, these were animals adapted to relatively dry seasonal environments. Their massive bodies required huge amounts of food. Their territorial ranges were enormous. Their reproduction strategies assumed relatively stable conditions. The megamonsoons destroyed all of that. Territories flooded. Food sources vanished. Temperature regulation became a nightmare for animals carrying hundreds of pounds of body mass, and their reproduction was too slow to adapt quickly. Most of these dominant animals laid eggs, probably in specific nesting sites that had to be dry. When those sites flooded year after year for thousands of years, entire generations failed to hatch. But dinosaurs were small enough to be flexible. They could survive in marginal habitats. They could exploit temporary resources. Most importantly, they could move. When one area flooded, they could walk to another. When food disappeared in one region, they could run to the next valley. This is what biologists call an ecological release event. The dominant competitors get knocked back, and suddenly all these marginal players have room to breathe, room to evolve, room to diversify. And diversify they did. The fossil record from the Middle and Late Carnian, during and right after the main pulse of the pluvial episode, shows something remarkable. Dinosaur diversity explodes. New species appear rapidly. Body sizes start to vary wildly. Dietary specializations emerge. Within just a few million years, which is extremely fast in evolutionary terms, dinosaurs go from maybe a dozen known species to dozens, then hundreds. They weren't just surviving the rain, they were thriving in it. Part of this was pure luck, being in the right place at the right time with the right body plan. But part of it was genuine competitive advantage. Those adaptations that had made early dinosaurs marginal in the old world made them perfect for the new one. Their upright stance, legs positioned directly under their bodies, suddenly mattered a lot more. In waterlogged environments where you're constantly moving through mud, shallow water and unstable ground, efficiency of movement becomes critical. Sprawling animals, legs out to the sides, sink deeper and expend more energy with every step. Upright dinosaurs could cover ground faster while burning fewer calories. Their elevated metabolism, if they had it, would have been crucial in the new humid environments. Cold-blooded animals struggle in constant cloud cover and rain because they depend on sunlight to regulate their body temperature. Warm-blooded or partially warm-blooded animals can stay active regardless of weather. In a world where it's raining constantly and the sun barely breaks through, that's a massive advantage. Their relatively small size initially was perfect for the fragmented landscape. The mega-monsoons created a patchwork world, small dry areas separated by flooded lowlands, forested regions broken up by rivers and lakes. Large animals need large territories. Small animals can thrive in pockets. Early dinosaurs could live in areas that were too small to support the giant Rauisuchians. And then there's the diet issue. Many early dinosaurs were omnivores or at least flexible carnivores. They could eat insects, small animals, eggs, carrion, probably some plant material. When the mega-monsoons disrupted food chains, specialists suffered. Animals that could only eat one type of plant or only hunted one type of prey went extinct when their food disappeared. Generalists like early dinosaurs could switch food sources as conditions changed. But perhaps most importantly, dinosaurs were innovators. The fossil evidence shows them developing new adaptations at an incredible pace during this period. Some lineages started getting bigger, moving into predator niches left empty by extinct competitors. Others developed specialized teeth for processing the new types of vegetation that were spreading in the humid environments. Still others became more specialized runners, developing longer legs and lighter builds for pursuing prey across the transformed landscape. By the time the main phase of the Carnian pluvial episode ended around 232 million years ago, the world was completely different, and dinosaurs were no longer marginal players. They were becoming dominant. Fossil assemblages from the late Carnian and early Nourian, the period right after the rain, showed dinosaurs making up 30%, 40%, sometimes 50% of the animal species in an ecosystem. The old rulers were mostly gone. Rauisuchians were extinct or reduced to a few relic species. Etosaurs were declining. The mammal-like cynodonts were retreating into small-bodied nocturnal niches, the ancestors of true mammals, but no longer competitors for dominance. Dinosaurs were rising. Some of the early success stories are preserved in the fossil record with stunning clarity. In what's now New Mexico, we find Quilophysis, a slender bipedal predator about 10 feet long that lived in the late Triassic, after the rain. Fossils show they lived in groups, possibly hunting cooperatively. Their bones are light and hollow, built for speed and efficiency. They represent one of the first successful dinosaur predators to spread across a wide geographic range. In South America, we find Plateosaurus, one of the first large herbivorous dinosaurs. Growing up to 30 feet long, these early dinosaurs were exploiting the expanded plant life that flourished in the post-deluge world. Their teeth show adaptations for processing tough vegetation. Their bodies show the beginnings of the massive structural supports that would later characterize the giant sauropods. In Europe and Africa, we find smaller species like Lilian sternus, mid-sized predators filling niches between the small opportunists and the emerging large predators. The diversity is stunning. Within 10 million years of the rain starting, dinosaurs had evolved into dozens of distinct ecological roles. But they weren't done, not even close, because the Carnian pluvial episode didn't just clear out the competition, it fundamentally reorganized ecosystems in ways that favored dinosaur dominance for the next 150 million years. The massive expansion of plant life during the wet period created abundant food sources. The erosion and flooding created rich soils. The climate reorganization produced more stable, predictable conditions in many regions, and the extinction of competitors meant dinosaurs faced less resistance as they continued to diversify. By the Jurassic period, starting around 201 million years ago, dinosaurs were absolutely dominant. They occupied every major terrestrial ecological niche. Massive sauropods like Brachiosaurus, 80 feet long and weighing 60 tons, the largest land animals ever to walk the earth. Theropod predators like Allosaurus, 30-foot-long carnivores that hunted in packs. Armored dinosaurs, horned dinosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs, flying pterosaurs that weren't technically dinosaurs but closely related archosaurs that rose alongside them. For 150 million years, from the end of the Triassic to the asteroid impact 66 million years ago, dinosaurs ruled the planet. They spread to every continent. They adapted to every environment from polar forests to tropical swamps to arid deserts. They evolved intelligence, complex social behaviors, elaborate display structures and body plans so bizarre we're still trying to understand how they worked. And it all started with rain. With 2 million years of water falling from the sky, destroying the old world and creating opportunities for a group of marginal reptiles to become the most successful land animals in Earth's history. This is what makes the Carnian pluvial episode so fascinating and so often overlooked. Most people know about the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. It's dramatic, catastrophic, easy to understand. A rock from space. Boom! Dinosaurs gone. But the event that made dinosaurs dominant in the first place? That's just rain. Persistent, relentless, world-changing rain that most people have never heard of. Yet without those 2 million years of water, without the ecological chaos and competitive release and environmental reorganization, dinosaurs might have remained marginal. They might have gone extinct during one of the later Triassic extinctions. They might never have evolved beyond small bipedal opportunists. Every Tyrannosaurus rex, every Triceratops, every Stegosaurus, every massive sauropod that shook the ground with its footsteps, they all owed their existence to that ancient deluge. Their family tree traced back to small reptiles that survived and thrived while the rain fell and the old world drowned. And here's the really wild part. We wouldn't be here either, because when dinosaurs finally did go extinct 66 million years ago, they left behind ecological space for another group of marginal animals to rise. Small, furry, mostly nocturnal creatures that had been living in dinosaurs' shadows for over 150 million years. Mammals, our ancestors. But that's getting ahead of the story. For now, in the late Triassic, dinosaurs are just beginning their incredible journey from nobody to ruler of the world. And it's all because they were the right animals, with the right adaptations in the right place. When the rain came and everything changed. But dinosaurs weren't the only organisms having the time of their lives. While archosaurs were taking over the large herbivore and predator niches, the endless rain was creating opportunities across every level of the ecosystem. The Carnian pluvial episode wasn't just the age of early dinosaurs, it was the age of transformation for dozens of lineages that would shape life on Earth for the next 150 million years. Start with the forests themselves. Before the deluge, terrestrial plant life was dominated by seed ferns, cycads, and various primitive conifers that could tolerate the hot, dry conditions of the late Triassic. They were tough, drought-adapted, able to survive with minimal water. But they weren't particularly diverse or productive. Then 2 million years of rain changed everything. The new conifers that emerged during the CPE weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Modern conifer families, the ones we recognise today, pines, spruces, firs, redwoods, began their evolutionary radiation during this period. And radiation is the right word. Within a few 100,000 years, conifer diversity exploded. Dozens of new genera appeared in the fossil record, each adapted to slightly different rainfall patterns, soil types, and elevations. These weren't the stunted, water-stressed trees of the early Triassic. These were massive organisms, some growing over 200 feet tall, their root systems reaching deep into newly saturated soils. For the first time in Earth's history, you could walk through forests that looked almost modern. Dense canopies that blocked out most sunlight. Thick layers of needles carpeting the forest floor. The smell of resin hanging heavy in the humid air. And here's what made these forests so revolutionary. They were producing resources on a scale nothing had seen before. All that rainfall meant constant growth. Trees putting on wood year after year without the growth rings stopping during dry seasons. Cones producing seeds by the millions. Resin flowing so abundantly that some deposits from this period are still mined for amber today. 230 million-year-old time capsules preserving insects and plant fragments from the height of the wet world. The animals noticed. Of course they noticed. Those conifer forests became the foundation for entirely new ecosystems, and one group in particular saw opportunity written across every branch and root, the crocodilomorphs. Now, when you hear crocodile, you probably picture something lurking in a river, waiting to ambush prey at the water's edge. And you're not wrong, that strategy has worked brilliantly for modern crocodilians. But their ancestors during the CPE were doing something completely different. The earliest crocodilomorphs weren't aquatic at all. They were terrestrial predators, some no bigger than house cats, others the size of wolves, running on long legs through those new conifer forests. They had slender snouts packed with sharp teeth. Flexible bodies built for speed rather than aquatic ambush. Some species probably climbed trees, others dug burrows, a few became specialized insect eaters, but the endless rain created something these early crocodilomorphs couldn't ignore. Endless water, rivers that ran year-round instead of seasonally, lakes that didn't dry up every summer, wetlands that stretched for hundreds of miles, and in all that water, fish, lots and lots of fish. Different crocodilomorph lineages began experimenting with semi-aquatic lifestyles. Some developed flattened tails for swimming. Others evolved nostrils that migrated toward the tops of their snouts, letting them breathe while mostly submerged. A few lineages developed the armor plating that would become the signature trait of modern crocodilians. This wasn't a single evolutionary event. Multiple crocodilomorph groups independently discovered that those CPE-created waterways were ecological gold mines. By the end of the rainy period, you had dozens of distinct semi-aquatic and fully aquatic crocodilomorph species, from tiny fish eaters no bigger than otters to massive predators approaching 20 feet in length. The pattern would continue for millions of years. Every time conditions changed, crocodilomorphs would adapt, diversify, try new survival strategies. They became one of the most successful vertebrate groups in Earth's history, and it all started with that first crocodilomorph looking at a CPE-created river and thinking, I wonder what's down there. While crocodilomorphs were conquering the waterways, another group was looking up, way up, the pterosaurs, Earth's first true flying vertebrates. And the CPE gave them exactly the world they needed to evolve and diversify. The earliest pterosaur fossils appear right at the beginning of the Carnian pluvial episode. Coincidence? Probably not. Flying requires specific atmospheric conditions. You need air dense enough to provide lift, but not so humid that wings get waterlogged. The CPE, for all its wetness, created exactly those conditions across vast regions. Those first pterosaurs were small, probably no larger than modern seagulls. They had long tails that helped with stability during flight, teeth perfectly designed for catching insects or small fish, and wings. Those incredible wings. Not feathered like birds, which wouldn't evolve for another 80 million years, but membranous, stretched between elongated fourth fingers and their hind limbs like living kites. The physics of pterosaur flight are remarkable. They weren't just gliding like some modern lizards. They were capable of powered, sustained flight, flapping wings generating thrust and lift, banking, diving, climbing. True masters of three-dimensional movement, and the CPE gave them the perfect training ground. All those new conifer forests created updrafts and thermals as sunlight hit the canopy and heated the air beneath. The constant rainfall meant predictable wind patterns. The explosion of insect diversity, we'll get to that in a moment, meant endless food sources. Early pterosaurs weren't just surviving in this world. They were perfectly adapted to exploit it. Within a few million years of their first appearance, pterosaurs had diversified into multiple ecological niches. Some species specialized in catching insects on the wing. Others became fish eaters, skimming across those endless CPE-created lakes and rivers. A few evolved filter-feeding adaptations, straining tiny organisms from the water like airborne flamingos. They spread across Pangaea with remarkable speed. Pterosaur fossils from the late Carnian appear on multiple continents, evidence that these animals could travel vast distances. They were the first vertebrates to truly conquer the air, and they did it in a world drowning in rain. The oceans weren't being left out of the CPE revolution either. All that rainfall had consequences for marine ecosystems. Millions of cubic miles of fresh water pouring into the seas, lowering salinity in coastal regions, creating enormous brackish zones where rivers met oceans, changing ocean chemistry and circulation patterns. Marine reptiles that had dominated Triassic seas, the placodonts, nothosaurs and early ichthyosaurs, faced a crisis. Their preferred prey, shellfish and fish adapted to specific salinity levels, were being wiped out or forced to migrate. The old rules no longer applied. But crisis creates opportunity. New marine reptile lineages began appearing in the fossil record. The thalatosaurs, long-bodied swimmers with powerful tails, diversified into dozens of species. Some developed specialized teeth for crushing mollusks. Others became pursuit predators, chasing fish through restructured marine environments. The ichthyosaurs, already well established, underwent their own evolutionary radiation. New species appeared with different body shapes, feeding strategies, and size ranges. Some became deep-diving specialists, their bones showing adaptations for withstanding extreme pressure. Others stayed in shallow coastal waters, taking advantage of the brackish zones created by all that rainfall. Most remarkably, the CPE set the stage for the evolution of later marine reptile dynasties. The plesiosaurs and pliosaurs, which would dominate Jurassic and Cretaceous oceans, trace their ancestry to lineages that first appeared or diversified during the Wet World. The CPE had restructured marine ecosystems so thoroughly that entirely new survival strategies became possible. But perhaps no group benefited more from the endless rain than the insects. And when I say benefited, I mean exploded. Pre-CPE insect diversity was already impressive. Insects had been around for over 200 million years by this point. But the Wet World sent their evolution into overdrive. All those conifer forests created endless new habitats. All that standing water provided breeding grounds for aquatic larvae. All that humidity favoured soft-bodied insects that would have desiccated in drier climates. Modern insect orders that we recognise today, the beetles, true flies, lacewings, caddisflies, underwent massive diversifications during the CPE. The fossil record shows an explosion of new body plans, feeding strategies, and life cycles, all appearing within a relatively narrow time window. The beetles in particular went absolutely wild. Before the CPE, beetles were present but not particularly diverse. After, they became the most successful animal order on the planet, a position they still hold today with over 400,000 described species. The CPE created forests gave them everything they needed: dead wood to tunnel through, seeds to eat, other insects to prey upon, endless ecological niches waiting to be filled. The appearance of the first true flies during this period revolutionized decomposition and nutrient cycling. Fly larvae became essential components of the food web, breaking down dead plant and animal matter, recycling nutrients back into the soil. Without flies, those massive conifer forests would have been buried under their own debris. Aquatic insects diversified just as dramatically. The ancestors of modern mayflies, dragonflies, and caddisflies all trace back to CPE radiations. They developed complex life cycles, spending larval stages underwater and adult stages in the air, perfectly exploiting both realms of the Wet World. And all these insects provided food. Enormous amounts of food. For fish, for early crocodilomorphs, for pterosaurs, for small terrestrial vertebrates. Insects became the energetic foundation supporting multiple trophic levels. The Wet World ran on insect power. Which brings us to the most unexpected winners of all, the ancestors of mammals, the cynodonts and their close relatives, often called mammal-like reptiles, though that term isn't quite accurate. These were the inheritors of the Therapsid dynasty that had dominated the Permian, and they were staging a comeback. Before the CPE, cynodonts were doing okay but not great. They were mostly small insectivores and omnivores, keeping their heads down while archosaurs dominated the large animal niches. The great dying of the early Triassic had hit them hard, and they'd spent millions of years in recovery mode. But the Wet World changed their fortunes. All those insects we just talked about? Cynodont heaven. The diversification of conifer forests created ground-level habitats rich with invertebrate prey. The constant rainfall meant water was never a limiting factor, and perhaps most importantly, the explosion of archosaur diversity created evolutionary pressure that pushed cynodonts toward the adaptations that would eventually define mammals. Some cynodont lineages developed more efficient respiratory systems, allowing higher activity levels. Others evolved more sophisticated teeth, with differentiated incisors, canines and molars instead of the uniform teeth of their ancestors. A few began developing fur or fur-like insulation, helping maintain body temperature in the humid but sometimes cool conditions. Most remarkably, evidence suggests some cynodont species were developing increasingly sophisticated parental care. Instead of laying eggs and leaving, some species may have been guarding nests, feeding young, investing more resources in fewer offspring. The foundation of mammalian reproductive strategies was being laid in the Wet World. The smallest cynodonts, some no bigger than modern shrews, were probably already partially warm-blooded. Maintaining elevated body temperatures gave them advantages in the dense competitive forests of the CPE. They could be active at night when cold-blooded competitors were sluggish. They could exploit food sources that required sustained activity to access. By the end of the Carnian pluvial episode, cynodonts had diversified into dozens of species across multiple continents. They weren't dominant, not yet. But they were positioned perfectly for the next 150 million years of evolution, carrying adaptations refined in the wet world that would eventually let their descendants, true mammals, survive the death of the dinosaurs and inherit the Earth. The freshwater ecosystems themselves became unrecognisably complex. Before the CPE, lakes and rivers were relatively simple environments. A few fish species, some invertebrates, maybe some amphibians. But 2 million years of persistent rainfall created freshwater habitats on a scale and complexity Earth had never seen. Those environments became fully realised ecosystems in their own right. Multiple fish species at different trophic levels, specialised invertebrates adapted to fast-flowing rivers versus still lakes, amphibians diversifying into dozens of forms, early crocodilomorphs transitioning to aquatic lifestyles, aquatic insects forming the base of elaborate food webs. For the first time in Earth's history, freshwater ecosystems were approaching the complexity of marine environments. They would remain that way, continuously evolving and diversifying right up to the present day. Every river, lake and wetland you see today is the descendant of those CPE-created waterways, still following ecological rules established when the sky wouldn't stop crying. The wet world was creating winners everywhere you looked. Not just dinosaurs, though they were certainly important, but dozens of lineages across every major group of organisms. Plants, insects, vertebrates of all kinds, all being transformed by endless rain into forms that would dominate for ages to come. This was the Triassic becoming the Jurassic. This was the old world dying and the new one being born, and it was all happening because the sky had broken open and wouldn't close for 2 million years. But nothing lasts forever. Not even rain that seems eternal. And then one year, in some unnamed place on the supercontinent of Pangaea, something changed. The rain that had fallen every single day for longer than anyone or anything could remember didn't come. Maybe it was just one day at first, a single morning when the clouds parted and actual sunlight, real direct sunlight, touched ground that hadn't felt it in millennia. The animals that witnessed it probably didn't understand what they were seeing. How could they? No living thing had experienced a truly clear sky in thousands of generations. But that one day became 2 days, then a week, then a month, then a season. Around 230 million years ago, roughly 2 million years after the Carnian pluvial episode began, the endless deluge finally started to break. This wasn't a sudden stop. Nothing in Earth's climate systems happens instantly. The transition from perpetual rain to more normal conditions took thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands. It was gradual enough that no single generation would have noticed the change. But it was happening. Deep beneath the Earth's crust, the massive volcanic system that had been pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere for 2 million years was finally exhausting itself. The Wrangellia Large Igneous Province, that enormous volcanic complex stretching across what would eventually become Alaska and British Columbia, was running out of magma. The immense chambers of molten rock that had fed countless eruptions were cooling, solidifying, becoming dormant. Without that constant injection of greenhouse gases, the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels began to fall. Not quickly, but steadily. The enhanced greenhouse effect that had supercharged the hydrological cycle started to weaken. Here's what that looked like on the ground. In the tropical regions near the equator of Pangaea, the afternoon thunderstorms that had been a daily certainty for 2 million years started becoming less reliable. Some days they came, some days they didn't. The massive river systems that had carved channels across the landscape began to shrink. Not all at once, but year by year their flows decreased. Floodplains that had been underwater for geological ages started to emerge. Mud that had been saturated for millennia began to dry out and harden. Plants that had evolved to live in permanent swamps suddenly found themselves exposed to air and occasional drought. Most of them died, but some, the ones that had maintained or developed drought tolerance during brief dry spells in the rain, they survived. And in surviving, they inherited the earth. The mega-monsoons that had dominated the interior of Pangaea weakened. The temperature differential between ocean and land that had driven those massive seasonal rain systems began to moderate. Summers were still wet, but not catastrophically so. Winters became drier, sometimes even dry enough that soil could crack and plants could experience real water stress. This was something new, something the world hadn't seen since before the rains began. For the first time in 2 million years, ecosystems had to deal with seasonality, with the concept of wet and dry periods. This forced another round of evolutionary adaptation. The species that had survived the initial onset of rain now had to survive its departure. In the higher latitudes, away from the equatorial regions, the changes were even more dramatic. Areas that had been temperate rainforests for 2 million years began transitioning to seasonal forests, then to open woodlands, and in some regions to something approaching grasslands, though true grasses wouldn't evolve for another 100 million years. The coal swamps, those vast peat-accumulating wetlands that had been steadily laying down carbon-rich deposits throughout the rainy period, began to dry up. Some transitioned to drier forest types, others became seasonal wetlands, flooded part of the year, dry the rest. The geological record preserves this transition. In rock cores taken from Carnian Age deposits, you can see the change layer by layer. The dark, organic, rich rocks that indicate waterlogged conditions give way to lighter-coloured sandstones and mudstones that show evidence of seasonal drying, cracking, and exposure to air. But the most profound changes were happening in the oceans. The massive influx of fresh water and sediment that had poured into the seas for 2 million years finally began to slow. Coastal waters that had been turbid, low-oxygen death zones started to clear. Salinity levels began to normalise. The ocean chemistry, which had been disrupted by both the volcanic carbon dioxide and the enormous volume of river runoff, slowly restabilised. This allowed the surviving marine species to expand again. Coral reefs, which had been reduced to tiny refugees in the clearest, most stable waters, began to recover. Not the same species that had built reefs before, those were mostly extinct, but new types of corals, ones that had evolved during the crisis to tolerate more variable conditions. The ammonoids, those shelled cephalopods that had nearly been wiped out in the early phases of the rain, began to diversify explosively. The few lineages that survived the bottleneck radiated into hundreds of new forms, each adapted to different ocean depths, different feeding strategies, different ecological niches. Marine reptiles, the ichthyosaurs and early plesiosaurs that had emerged during the rainy period, found a world full of opportunities. With so many marine ecosystems disrupted and recovering, there was room for innovation, for new predatory strategies, for evolutionary experimentation. By the end of the Triassic period, 50 million years after the rain stopped, the oceans would be dominated by reptiles in a way they had never been before, and would never be again. On land, the world that emerged from the rain was unrecognisable compared to the one that had entered it. The dominant animals were completely different. Remember, when the rain started, the world was ruled by large herbivorous synapsids and the predatory archosaurs that hunted them. By the time the rain stopped, the synapsids were mostly gone, reduced to small, nocturnal, rodent-like animals, the ancestors of all mammals, hiding in burrows and eating insects. The world now belonged to the dinosaurs, but they weren't the dinosaurs you're picturing. Not yet. The earliest post-rain dinosaurs were relatively small, bipedal creatures, mostly carnivorous, none larger than a large dog. But they had something the other surviving animals lacked, a combination of traits that made them uniquely suited to exploit the new world emerging from the deluge. They were fast, their upright posture and digitigrade locomotion, walking on their toes, gave them speed and efficiency that sprawling reptiles couldn't match. They were efficient breathers, their respiratory systems, with air sacs that would eventually evolve into the flight apparatus of birds, allowed them to maintain activity levels other reptiles couldn't sustain. They were potentially warm-blooded, or at least closer to it than their competitors, though this is still debated among paleontologists. Most importantly, they were adaptable. The dinosaur body plan proved capable of incredible evolutionary flexibility. Over the next 165 million years, dinosaurs would evolve into everything from tiny bird-sized insectivores to 100-ton sauropods, from swift bipedal hunters to armoured quadrupedal tanks. But that diversification started in the world that emerged from the rain, in the changing landscapes and ecosystems of the late Triassic. The pterosaurs, those flying reptiles that had first appeared during the rainy period, also found the new world to their liking. As the climate dried and forests opened up, there was more space in the skies, more opportunities for aerial hunters. Early pterosaurs were small, probably insectivores, but they would eventually evolve into the largest flying animals that ever existed, with wingspans exceeding 30 feet. The crocodilomorphs, ancestors of modern crocodiles, were also thriving. Interestingly, early crocodilomorphs weren't all aquatic. Many were terrestrial, some were even bipedal runners, looking more like dinosaurs than the crocodiles we know today. The rain had created countless river systems, lakes and wetlands, and as these persisted even after the rain stopped, they provided perfect habitats for semi-aquatic predators. The crocodilomorph body plan, perfected in these post-rain environments, proved so successful that it's barely changed in 230 million years. But what about the ecosystems themselves? How were they different after the rain? The most obvious change was in plant communities. The leucopsids and ferns that had dominated the wet world of the Carnian pluvial episode gave way to conifers and other seed plants. This wasn't just a change in dominant species, it was a fundamental shift in how forests functioned. Conifers, with their deep root systems and drought-resistant needles, could tolerate the seasonal climate variability that was now the norm. They could grow in soils that dried out periodically. They could survive wildfires, which were becoming more common as dry seasons allowed fuel to accumulate. Over the next 50 million years, conifer forests would spread across much of Pangaea, creating the landscapes that dinosaurs would call home for the rest of the Mesozoic. Flowering plants hadn't evolved yet. They wouldn't appear for another 100 million years, but the seed plants that dominated the post-rain world were setting the stage for them. They were developing pollination strategies, seed dispersal mechanisms, and relationships with animals that would later be refined when flowers appeared. The world was also becoming more geographically diverse. During the peak of the rain, many regions had been homogenized. Everything was wet, everything was warm, everything looked more or less the same. But as the climate stabilized and dried, regional differences emerged. The interior of Pangaea became truly arid, developing the first major desert system since before the rain. Coastal regions remained wetter, developing forests and woodlands. High latitudes, though still warmer than today, became more seasonal, with distinct growing and dormant periods. This geographic diversity drove evolutionary diversity. Species adapting to deserts developed different traits than species adapting to forests. Isolated populations began diverging genetically. The homogenizing effect of the rain was replaced by a diversifying effect of geographic isolation. This is why the late Triassic and early Jurassic periods show such explosive diversification across all groups: dinosaurs, pterosaurs, crocodilomorphs, mammals, marine reptiles, fish, insects. The world was opening up again, creating ecological niches faster than evolution could fill them. The geological evidence for all of this is written in rocks around the world. The Carnian pluvial episode created a distinct marker in the geological record, a layer of dark, carbon-rich sediments sandwiched between lighter-coloured, drier deposits. This layer is found on every continent, evidence that the rain really was a global phenomenon. Above this layer, the rocks tell the story of recovery and change. Sediments become coarser, indicating stronger seasonal rivers. Red beds appear, rocks stained by iron oxides that form when sediments are exposed to air and oxygen. Evaporate deposits, minerals that precipitate when water evaporates, appear in the fossil record, something impossible during the endless rain. Paleontologists use this transition to divide the Triassic period into distinct phases. The Middle Triassic represents the world before the rain, dominated by synapsids and early archosaurs. The Late Carnian, during the rain itself, is a period of crisis and turnover, when old lineages go extinct and new ones emerge. The Post-Carnian, Late Triassic and Early Jurassic represent the New World, the age of dinosaurs beginning in earnest. This division isn't arbitrary, it's based on real, measurable changes in ecosystems, climate, and the species that dominated the planet. The Carnian pluvial episode was a hinge point in Earth's history, a moment when one world ended and another began. And here's what's truly remarkable when you step back and look at the big picture. 2 million years of rain, caused by volcanic activity pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, leading to runaway climate change, ecosystem collapse, mass extinction, and eventual recovery into a new climatic regime. Sound familiar? We're living through a similar process right now, just compressed into a much shorter time frame. Human activity is pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at rates that rival or exceed the Rangelia volcanic province. We're seeing rainfall patterns change, ecosystems collapse, species go extinct. The difference is, the Carnian pluvial episode took 2 million years to unfold. We're trying to do the same thing in 200 years. The Earth will recover from what we're doing. It always does. Life always finds a way. But the question isn't whether the planet will survive. It's whether we will, and what world we'll be leaving for whatever species comes after us. The dinosaurs inherited a world transformed by rain. What will inherit the world we're transforming? We're living through our own hinge point in history, our own division between the world that was and the world that will be. The Carnian pluvial episode shows us that Earth systems can change profoundly, that dominant species can be replaced, that no rain lasts forever. But it also shows us that life persists, adapts, and diversifies, that crisis creates opportunity, that endings enable beginnings. 2 million years of rain fundamentally redirected the course of life on Earth. It ended the age of synapsids and began the age of dinosaurs. It transformed ecosystems, rearranged food webs, and created the conditions for 165 million years of dinosaur dominance, all because of rain. Sometimes the most powerful forces aren't asteroids or supervolcanoes. Sometimes they're just water falling from the sky, day after day, year after year, millennium after millennium, until nothing is the same as it was before. So here we are, 232 million years in the past, standing at the end of 2 million years of rain. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how wild this journey has been. We started on a world of endless deserts, a supercontinent baking under an angry sun, where the interior was basically uninhabitable for anything larger than a lizard. Then the sky broke open. Not for a day, not for a year, not even for a century. For 2 million years straight, the rain came down. Mega monsoons that would make our worst storms look like light drizzle. Humidity that turned the air into soup. Rivers carving canyons overnight. Oceans rising and falling like the planet couldn't decide what it wanted to be. And through it all, life didn't just survive, it transformed. Species that had dominated for millions of years vanished. New ones emerged from obscurity to become the rulers of the world. Dinosaurs went from bit players in the background to the main characters in Earth's greatest story, and they weren't alone. Turtles, crocodiles, mammals, insects, all the major groups of modern animals got their start or their big break during those wet millennia. 2 million years of rain didn't just change the landscape, it rewrote the entire script of life on Earth. Now, let's put that timescale in perspective. 2 million years. That's incomprehensible to us. Human civilization, everything we've ever built, every city, every empire, every technological achievement, all of recorded history, that's about 10,000 years. Maybe 12,000 if you're generous. 2 million years is 200 times longer than all of human civilization. It's enough time for a small shrew-like creature to evolve into a blue whale. It's enough time for continents to drift hundreds of miles. It's enough time for mountains to rise from the sea and erode back to plains. And for every single one of those 2 million years, it rained. Generation after generation of creatures born into a world where the sky was always falling, where dry land was precious, where everything was constantly wet, rotting, shifting, changing. They never knew anything else. This wasn't a disaster to them. This was just the world. Normal. The way things had always been and presumably always would be. But here's what really gets me. As long as that period was, it was still just a moment in Earth's history. A geological eye blink. Our planet is 4.5 billion years old. The Carnian pluvial episode, as massive and transformative as it was, represents less than 1/20th of 1% of Earth's total history. It's a tiny sliver in the immense story of our world. And yet, in that tiny sliver, everything changed. The entire future of life on Earth was redirected. This teaches us something profound about our planet. Change can happen fast. Not fast by human standards necessarily, but fast in geological terms. Stable climates are temporary. What seems permanent can transform in what amounts to an instant on geological timescales. The comfortable, stable world we know is not Earth's default state. It's just the current moment, one configuration among countless others the planet has cycled through. And that brings us uncomfortably close to the present day, because we're living through a period of rapid climate change right now. Human activity has altered the atmosphere faster than almost any natural process in Earth's history. We're pumping greenhouse gases into the air at rates that would have seemed impossible even a century ago. Now, our current situation isn't the same as the Carnian pluvial episode. Different causes, different timescales, different mechanisms, but the Carnian teaches us what can happen when Earth's climate system gets kicked out of equilibrium. Feedback loops amplify. Systems that seemed stable break down. Life adapts, but adaptation means winners and losers, extinctions and explosions. The comfortable creatures that were perfectly suited to the old world don't survive. The weird ones hiding in the margins suddenly inherit everything. We can't predict exactly what will happen next in our own climate story, but the deep past shows us the kinds of transformations that are possible, the scales at which Earth systems can change, the ways that life responds when the rules suddenly shift. It's humbling, and maybe a little terrifying, but also weirdly reassuring. Because here's the thing, life survived the Carnian, not just survived, thrived. The world that emerged from those 2 million years of rain was more diverse, more complex, more vibrant than what came before. Earth didn't break, it transformed. Whatever happens next in our planet's story, life will adapt. It always has. The question is what form that adaptation takes, and whether we'll be among the survivors or the casualties. But that's a story for another time. For now, thank you for spending this time with me, exploring a world so ancient and alien it barely seems real. Thank you for letting this story accompany your rest, for opening your mind to the deep past while your body prepares for sleep. If you enjoyed this journey through 232 million years of history, I'd be grateful if you consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more people discover these stories, and I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop a comment and let me know. It's amazing to think about people all over the planet, in dozens of countries, all drifting off to sleep while learning about ancient Earth. If you'd like to support the channel further, there's an optional YouTube membership available, but honestly, just being here, just listening, that means everything. Now, sleep well. Dream of ancient rains, of forests that have been gone for 200 million years, of creatures whose descendants still walk among us. Dream of a world that was once unimaginably different, and yet led, step by step, reign by reign, to the world we know today. Good night.